Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Rahi join us for a conversation about the connection between erotic pleasure and our collective liberation. Together, we talk about tuning in to the language of the body, rewriting our sexual patterns, and finding the pleasure of presence. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. And I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, oh gosh, the power of the body. Wow. Dear listener, can you just take a moment to feel? Just take a moment to notice, to tune into your own body today, and take that deep breath with me. And release, let go. I'm going to do another deep breath, inhaling. And relax and let it go. Gosh, this time of year and just in general with our life and everything that's going on in the world, it can be so chaotic, so busy, moving at 100 miles per hour. As a therapist, I am in my brain constantly, and it is loud and fast, full of thoughts. And, you know, so much of our day-to-day is really outside of our control. These big systems, people, these dynamics, right? So much of it is outside of our control. But that ability to take that deep breath, right? That ability to give yourself that pleasure through that deep exhale, that's something that is always within your control. You know, when we get stressed out and activated, and I'm there too, dear listener, it can be hard to remember how powerful the breath is, right? To really allow that exhale to activate your parasympathetic nervous system to help you relax, right? It's like a body hack in some ways, you know. I fall into a hole, really, when I keep thinking that, oh, I'll just cognitively think my way through this problem. I'll cognitively think my way. But to remember that we can actually work with bottom-up processing, right, from the body up to the mind. And so I just hope that you can take that deep breath with me, your dear listener, and really allow yourself to relax and to be in the pleasure of presence. And you know, I am always talking about anarchy, and anarchy is about releasing the power of these oppressive structures. And gosh, it is so deep within our unconscious, and it is so deep within our bodies. We are fish in water that are just swimming in it, right? And so taking back some of that control with that deep exhale, dear listener, relax and allow that breath to give you some peace. And I know it's not going to change the whole world, right? There's such big systems going on, but gosh, when you can show up to that next event, that next situation, and be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more in your body, a little bit more open, there really is power in that. I trust in the ripples, right? Again, I'm going to take that deep breath with you. And I hope you can feel that pleasure as I experience it in your body too, right? And trusting that the more you can tap into that for yourself, the ripples you will create in your own community, right? And ultimately, the power of that large, large scale change when we are all in our bodies and we are all in the presence of being. All right, dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my research and personal exploration, then you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchypodcast, also linked in the show notes below. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love, and let's tune in to today's episode. So then the first question I'm going to ask you is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Well, given that this podcast is about anarchy, the way I would introduce myself, the way I will introduce myself is I am an anarchist of the ways in which modern society creates structure and obstacles to our organic life force. And I do this as a somatic practitioner involving sexual life force within the body. So I am a somatic sex educator, a sexological body worker. I've created a body of work called Somatic Sexual Wholeness, which frees that life force that is held by childhood ruptures or adolescent ruptures. So it's really resolving ruptures from our developmental years, from boundary repair, as well as unconscious patterns that keep our life force contained or restrained or repressed, particularly in the realm of intimate connection. So the easiest way to say this is I am a servant to aliveness and connection.
Beautiful. Wow. Endless opportunities to start exploring all of that, right? So I'm going to pause before we dive in too deep and ask if you could take some space to share your personal connection to these topics. How did you get here?
Oh man, that's really a beautiful jumping off point. I cannot speak to whatever cosmological journey my soul has been on. However, when I came out of my mother's womb, I came out with crooked legs. They were mangled based on how I was positioned during gestation. So the doctors wanted to do surgery on my infant knees, as doctors tend to do. But my mother, being a nurse, said, no way. And she lotioned and massaged my legs every night for 3 years until they grew out straight. So that's really where it started, was just understanding the mysterious, and I think not fully understood powers of human touch, intentional touch, I would say. Yeah. And so, at the same time, I was the second child. My older sister was a breech baby, which was so touch and go for my mom and my sister that the doctors came out to my dad and said, we can't save them both. One of them is going to, perish. And then my younger brother, who survived for 3 days, he was so weak in my mom's womb that at 10 months, the doctors pretty much manually forced him out. And my mom had such shock and trauma from that loss. This was during the time she was massaging my legs every night. What I know now is I think I was probably picking up on her pelvic trauma, and that's probably also informed my journey. So, those are kind of some of the early influences, I would say. And then I was, touch was my first language because it healed my body, and I massaged my parents growing up. And when I got to college, I was really fascinated with different forms of meditation. And yeah, I lived in Japan for a year. I lived in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand, practicing Vipassana. And somehow this combination of like presence and intentional touch on the tissues and fascia of the body had like an unraveling effect of armor and trauma. And so, I didn't know what was happening. I just saw the effects of it. And it really fascinated me to learn everything I could about how present, conscious, intentional touch on parts of the body can unravel armor. And so I went down a tantric path of becoming certified as a
Sure.
tantric teacher, healing the pelvic floor, inner pelvic work. It took me down a Taoist path. I spent time with a teacher in Thailand on different occasions, learning how to circulate, this life force energy consciously. And then eventually I got a master's in psychology, focusing on like how our initial touch imprints during our developmental years can create patterns of intimacy, touch, desire into our adult lives. And this is my kind of fascination because, you know, people, when they're unconscious, we don't realize that these patterns are there, but patterns can be repatterned. And that's kind of my jam.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of your personal journey with this. I even just that last piece right there, we've done a lot of work in somatics at my training site on birthing trauma, right? And how,
Yes.
yeah. And so,
Yes.
but my fear is always when we talk about that, this space of it then being disempowering to say, oh,
Mm,
this thing happened. So I appreciate you naming that you can repattern and change
mm,
these things, right? It's not this disempowering, you're stuck there, but it is important to name the location and how these things impact us, which
mm,
was making me think of the book, The Boy Who Was Raised a Dog. I don't know if you know
mm,
that one.
mm,
I had to read it for one of my trauma classes, and it was just talking about how, a child psychologist who was seeing a lot of, interesting cases and pinning it back to, yeah, lack of touch, lack of
mm,
caring, relational models, all the
mm,
sort of pieces here that you're talking about. And for me, I'm, still in my doctorate, finishing it up,
mm,
about to be out and free. And I just keep thinking, wow, I want to get out and study breath work and tantra and
mm,
the body. And so
mm.
sounds like you went down that path, and there's so much I
Yes.
could learn from you in this next hour of just
Mm,
what that means. Because obviously, in the field of psychology, I've got none of this, none of the body.
Well, yes. And what's going to be so exciting for you
Mhm.
is there's so many wonderful body-based modalities that don't understand the psychology component.
Sure.
So I mean, the blend is really where so much synergy and magic can happen. But I want to jump off because when you said, have you heard the book? I thought you were going to say The Secret Life of Babies
No, what is
because
that?
this book, it was a PhD thesis by Mia, I think her last name starts with a K, but her studies examined how during the birth experience there is an oxytocin release within the mother's body and the infant's body, and this is nature creating a bonding between mother and child and infant. But when there is a predominant, let's say, emotion as part of that, like I mentioned, my sister was a breech baby. So the emotion was desperation. That oxytocin gets paired with desperation, right? And that can create a certain pattern in one's life. So her book found, I mean, it's fascinating. So her book focuses on how our birth experience and this oxytocin release can create really lifelong behavioral patterns. These imprints are really impactful. And once again, I'm really fascinated with how this affects our sexual intimacy patterns.
Hmm.
The other thing I'll say is, yes, it's really important to focus on the capacity and opportunity for repatterning.
Right.
And I believe once something is repatterned, we get the benefit of the initial pattern because I feel like our souls come into these beings wanting to be challenged in order for the soul to really shine its coal into a diamond.
Hmm.
And that's the opportunity of patterns. And then the blessing of repatterns is we can let those go.
Right. Yeah. And I'm even starting to think just about the larger societal patterns that are so
Mm,
Unconscious. Yeah,
yes.
right. Of just,
Yeah.
yeah, you're already responding. Is there something you want to say to that?
Well, my God,
I
I
know.
mean, like, talk about control and,
Yeah.
wanting to be controlled or rebelling against control, like larger societal patterns. I just feel like there's so much around control, rebelling against control, enjoying control, manipulating control,
Hmm.
whether it's through words in the media or, politicians or, whatever. I mean, like every dynamic has this, dom sub dynamic, which is fascinating. And based on what pairing or association or wiring we had, either beneficial and pleasurable or harmful in our upbringing, we're going to respond the same way to these dom sub patterns as adults with
Hmm.
societal structures.
Yeah. And I always take it even another step further of just like existentially, right? We all live in this void where we seemingly have control, right? I'm going to drive
Hmm.
my car later to teach yoga, but who knows what's going to happen on that drive, right? There's so many different
Mm,
ways that it seems like we have control, but we don't. And so then I think even that desire to want to play with power is part of our existential reality of existence. But right, then it gets
yes.
even deeper when you do have these systems that are influencing you in certain ways, right? And I think,
Hmm.
spinning it into my own perspective with early Christianity, right? You're going to submit to the authority of your husband.
Mm,
Oh,
yeah,
what a power dynamic, right?
totally, totally.
Oh, so
Yeah.
I ask myself deep questions about that time of, did I have free will?
Mm, mm, hmm.
Do we even
Right.
have free will now as we sit in this
Totally.
cultural context and I'm influenced,
Exactly.
right? Deep questions, hard to know.
Yeah, hard to know. I think that's where psychedelics can play a really wonderful
Sure.
role in
Hmm.
really kind of seeing things, well, not even seeing, it's like being as we are. And I mean, in regards to control, because it really
Sure.
does
Oh,
require this surrender.
yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Which is why I don't know if I talked to you a little bit about the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy work that I do.
No, you haven't. No, but I assumed based on listening to some of your episodes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Just the go ahead.
Endlessly,
Yeah.
endlessly fascinating. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
so excited about this new kind of realm of discovery of human consciousness and human healing and the
Hmm.
potential of it based on psychedelic assisted therapy.
Right. Yeah. And it's really interesting when, we work with ketamine, so since currently that's the only legal psychedelic we can work with, but ketamine being more of a dissociative, right? Of
Mm,
course, you have the psychedelic experience before you get to that full state of dissociation, like we use it in surgeries, right? But
hmm.
before you get there, there is that psychedelic space. And typically, though, you lose that connection to the body. So it's really fascinating when we have clients that feel more of that or go through that, right? Given how much of a dissociative it is compared to maybe something like MDMA and other drugs. And then
Hmm.
at that point, we're trying to work with them somatically of, what is that energy? How do we want to, move through that, embrace and check
Mm.
in with that? So I'm curious. I'm sure you see a lot of that same sort of, trapped energy in the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a particular fascination, as a sexological body worker,
Hmm.
uh, regarding what amounts of what psychedelics can really support a client's journey and really being at peace and celebrating their embodiment and their journey and their vitality. And I went to one training where one of my trainers recommended a very small dose of psilocybin, for
Sure.
example, less than a gram, like zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.8. And what it often does is it just turns down the mental chatter for people who are very mental and just allows a deeper sensorial experience of their embodiment. For example, I've known clients who have received body work with MDMA, for example.
Sure.
There's one client who realized, actually in a bufo ceremony, he
Hmm.
realized that the perpetrator of a sexual abuse was his mother,
Mm.
and now, like, his life all made sense. He went mute for a year when he was 3, and like, it all made sense. But the MDMA allowed him to really get to feel some of the really distant emotions that were too overwhelming for him to feel. I think each aid it has to be used consciously, intentionally, and by choice by the body's nervous system, so that it is a in service of what wants to be healed or released. And I think it's really exciting because there's just a
Mhm.
lot of possibilities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Such a wide spectrum of opportunities. And I think it's tricky though, because it's like so many questions here, right? Because sometimes it does quiet that internal dialogue. Other
Hmm.
times it's the specific amplifier and turns it way, way up,
Mm.
right? And those thoughts are running. I've worked with a lot of clients who've explored psilocybin, and we work with them, not in the room, but in a harm reduction sort of way of
Mm.
how we work with them. And it completely amplifies those negative internal spaces, and then they get trapped there. Or I'm thinking about my own experiences on other psychedelics, right? Where I've tried, I explore non-monogamy and I try to work with my jealousy because I thought, oh, here's this drug that helps with unpacking things, in terms of
Mm.
dismantling the fear. And wow, a stimulant hits you. Let me tell you, that was probably the most intense experience of my
Whoa.
feelings.
Wow.
Because I was kind of curious, if we use this to
Mm.
process trauma, would it help to dismantle some jealousy? Okay,
Mm.
no, it turned it way up for me personally,
Wow.
like
Oh my
way up.
gosh. Wow.
But that's where I'm like, oh, it's so hard. And I mean, I guess
Yeah.
again, set and setting,
Right.
context of the mind, so many deep questions here with this one,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. But after it kind of like, it was full blown like into the jealousy,
Yeah.
did that, in what ways do you feel like that journey or that experience served your relationship with jealousy? Or
Oh, totally. Right.
uh-huh.
Yeah. Every single time I'm stretched and, that concept of like, oh, of a bad trip, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
No, there's so much insight. It might have been difficult. I mean, there's so many different ways we do that in life, right? We
Yeah.
had this journey, we struggled, we made the mistake, and we grow and we expand. So
Yes.
I think that, yeah, I look back on that experience as a beautiful stretching. And who knows if I would have tried to do it in an ordinary, quote unquote, state of consciousness. Who knows? Could have been worse. I don't know. It's hard to
Right.
kind of compare, but I was just hoping that it would dampen some of the effects. And I think the stimulant effects really like heightened
Turned it
it.
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, to your point, maybe that's what was necessary to kind of
Mhm.
like get closer to the other side of it. I mean, coming back to, modern anarchy,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of plant medicines because one, they're natural, they're from the earth, we are from the earth, and we have that, it's such a poignant reminder for me when I am with plant medicines, but in being reminded of our nature, our organic nature as, you know, organic vessels like plants, like all of that conditioning that is imposed onto us by society, by culture, by the norms, by all of this shoulds and shouldn'ts, kind of like evaporate or dissipate. That's what I'm interested in, for that life force to really like, find its organic flow.
Absolutely. It's that distancing, right? Where you start to look at the systems and go, well, hold on. Who
Hmm.
said that? Wait.
Right.
And just a little bit of that perspective to start asking
Hmm.
those deeper questions. And I imagine that, I'll be curious to see what future generations feel about this because I think that older generations, given the war on drugs, right, had such a
Right.
negative connotation about it in a way that when you experienced the love and capacity on these, you start to go, oh, what else was I lied to about?
Right.
In ways that maybe future generations won't even, right? It will just
Totally.
be like alcohol to them where they're like, this is exciting, right? And not have this sort of radical, oh my gosh, I need to ask questions about everything that many of us have had.
Yeah, I mean, it's so crazy to think how we've been indoctrinated in certain
Yes.
beliefs, I mean, especially around psychedelics in the 70s. But you're right. I think it's going to be exciting to see future generations where it's really prized and praised for the benefits it does bring. And I think
Mhm.
it can, I think it can be a whole new, frankly, effect on our societal trajectory. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think in terms of somatics, there's a lot of work that I do with psychedelics where we're processing trauma, right? And
Mm,
all of that sort of stuff. And of course, there's a space with all of these beautiful drugs to explore pleasure, right? Both
mm,
cognitively, but also somatically. I've had
yeah.
such beautiful experiences trying to stop the monkey brain from
Mm,
speaking at all to just feel and the amplification of your sensory experience. Wow. Even just thinking about trauma, whether you've had that capital T or you exist under the systems that are actively disconnecting us from our bodies every single day, right? Having this sort of experience where the volume is turned up on your somatic, you
hmm
taste the grape and you can feel the grindiness of the, outside layer and you feel
mm,
content from that one grape. Whoa, compared
yeah.
to the world of, okay, let me shovel down my food while I'm watching Netflix, right? Oof.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like our society is at an ever distracted state from our source, like from that state of being within which everything is provided, and I'm speaking in esoteric terms, but what I mean to say is like when we are very, very still in that infinite space of just being, there is so much pleasure just in being. And, here we are chasing after it with, all the different distractions that, we have in modern society. So, yeah, I feel like the more we drop into that source, the more kind of natural anarchy will evolve because we're going to rebel against like these, kind of these norms that expand or multiply these distractions.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny, hot take. I feel like just sitting with your thoughts for 10 minutes in modern society is enough of a psychedelic experience for some
Yeah.
people, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Myself
yeah.
included, that's hard. When am I ever just sitting, no music, no stimulus, right? I try to do that in my yoga teachings that
Mm,
I do. The first 10 minutes, everyone's laying on the floor, and I'm like, okay, we are breathing. And
hmm
just thinking about, in those moments, the thoughts that come to people's minds,
hmm
right? Part of, I think, the psychedelic work is even just the fact that you're actually just sitting there just with your thoughts, or at least that's how we work. We're telling people to go inward during that experience. And so, there's so many of us that don't even sit down for 10 minutes just to
hmm
notice what sort of thoughts come out. I've heard about people who have done darkness meditations,
Yes.
right? Yeah, and just
Yeah.
sitting with that and where do you go, right? What a trip in modern society.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, the way this relates to my work is that
Hmm.
it's so, so important for clients and for just people in general to have that downregulated stillness in order to attune to what their authentic desire is. Because I feel like in sexuality today, I mean, I'm going to generalize, but I just have a lot of clients who have been in these patterns of sexual intimacy with their, spouse of 15 or 20 years or their lover of 15 or 20 years. And it's almost like default automatic,
Mm.
and if unfortunately, if there's been a lack of foreplay, they just kind of go through the routine. And without really like, I mean, we can only really honor how that life force wants to flow when we are still and being present and attuning to it and listening for what its, like what its truth is. So this
Hmm.
is all to say that like being still and being with your source, is not just some esoteric experience or exercise or suggestion. It is in order to really be true to what it is, to attune to what it is that your body wants to experience, wants to express, wants to explore, wants to receive. And that's where, sexual armoring happens when we don't do that and we kind of don't have the consent of our body and kind of do things in a rote way without really being conscious of it.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many ways that the systems are to blame for that, right? Of course, we have empowerment to react to those systems and choose how we want to respond. But again, going it back to my earlier childhood of the ways I judged any sort of sexual liberation outside of a monogamous, and by monogamous, I mean one person for life, not the serial monogamy that we all do. I mean one person for life, right? straight heteronormative sex, right? Anything beyond that was gross and I judged it, right? So even any of my like bubbling queer desires was something that I really tried to suppress, right? So there's so many ways that whether it's even just sitting with the body or these systems that are telling us what's right, wrong, and otherwise, it's disconnecting us from our desires. And I'm thinking about in terms of the body, just the neuronal pathways, right? It's like a muscle, you know, in terms of your brain. And if you haven't spoken this language, you know, maybe you learned it early on, but you haven't spoken it now in years, it's hard to kind of really pick that up again. It's possible, right? And I think that people forget how much of our body and feeling into sensation is the same thing, right? Are these
Mm,
neuronal pathways that we're practicing to feel into what it feels like to, you know, have my hands touch? Like, what does this feel like? Can I feel
mm,
the tips of my toes? And again, if that's not a muscle I'm flexing, it's
mm,
not going to be there. So when we're trying to have sex, right? If that's
mm,
not a thing that we're practicing,
mm.
how in the world are you expecting to be fluent in a language that you don't speak in other areas of your life?
Oh, that is such a juicy and appropriate analogy. It's so true. It's like if you were used to frying an egg in one way your whole life, come on,
Mhm.
there's like a billion different ways to enjoy that egg,
Right.
right? I feel like the body is such an incredible access point for reconditioning. And so, we're so neuroplastic and we're so somatically like reconditionable. It's almost like this lab that we are gifted with, you know? So, what you share about like having your toes stimulated, having your elbows stimulated, having
Right.
your the back of your knees stimulated in new and different ways, like we don't realize. I mean, I would assume it's going to elicit pleasure, but it's also creating new possibilities for the body to recognize, oh, there's like another way to fry an egg.
Mhm.
And then imagine that brought into lovemaking or into
Mhm.
like in sexological body work, there's a practice we call genital mapping.
Right.
I mean, it sounds very simple. It is a somatic education of the erogenous zones, but a felt sense. So you can have a distinct feeling of how, the base of your clitoral shaft feels as opposed to the upper left quadrant of the glands, or,
Mhm.
for, the base of a penile shaft as opposed to the frenulum. And this is very important for a body to know what is possible in the erogenous landscape of my genitalia so I can actually give voice to what it is my body wants, right? And so like like I have clients and they'll rather than just saying, yeah, my pussy wants attention or my cock wants stroking, you can be very specific. And in that, I think is empowerment, is anarchy, is like opening your neural pathways up to new groove moves and grooves. I mean, there's just like a cornucopia of
Mhm.
possibilities there. And I feel like, I've seen workshops where they, talk about eroticism as like social anarchy,
Yeah.
because I feel like societies have, well, certainly religions, and there are places in the world now. I know in Kenya and Egypt and other countries, like clitoral circumcision is a practice today, and it's specifically to disempower those bodies from feeling their power and pleasure. So our erotic vortexes are incredible pathways to anarchy and personal liberation.
Mhm. Absolutely. It's ownership over our pleasure.
Yes.
And
Yes.
my thoughts are that to feel that level of pleasure requires, again, a level of presence, a
Mhm.
level of embodiment. And
Mhm.
when you're in that state, it is, in my opinion, much harder to look out at the world and not also cry.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I mean, when we really inhabit these beautiful magical vessels and open ourselves up to what it feels, yeah, there's so much that we're just holding at bay.
Mhm.
And so that makes me wonder, as a somatic therapist, like, we know that holding anything at bay or repressing any emotion, it, creates some sort of guarding pattern in the body, that desensitizes or creates some sort of discomfort. So we're all really walking around kind of in maximum management to survive. And it's so much more reason for like massive societal anarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the
Mm.
vision I see.
It's a great vision. I'm with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is remembering the practice nature of all of this, right? It's not like
Mm.
we're going to wake up and have that level of embodiment today, right? It starts with the 2 seconds, I don't know, 10 seconds you try to feel before the
Sure.
thoughts creep in of what are you doing? What are we doing later? What is this? What is that? Right. And it
Hmm.
starts there and you continue to stretch and expand. And I'm sure you learned a lot of that in your various, trainings that
Mm.
you did of what it means to be patient with the practice building of this embodiment.
It's quite a journey. I mean, I remember it was when I was at Buddhist monastery doing Vipassana, it was 21 days. And what's wonderful about a daily practice in a structure like that is you start to witness the mind and the mind's patterns consciously. So you know that when you first sit for a 50-minute sitting meditation, the first 10 minutes is going to be mind chatter until you fall into a zone, and then you're going to kind of cruise for a while, and then there's going to be discomfort in the body, which is going to wake up more mind chat. You know,
Right. Right.
you kind of know like what the patterns are, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're not kind of swept up by them unconsciously. Like they offer 10-day Vipassana retreats all over the country. I think they're free. So
Mm.
all over the world, I think the if you just Google it, Vipassana 10-day, that's the real beauty of it. And then you kind of like it's almost like oh, okay, there's the monkey mind, you know. It's like you don't take it personally, you're not kind of helpless or powerless to it, and you can kind of play with it and kind of make fun of
Mm-hmm.
it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And then my brain goes, oh, and here's the systems though, because who has 10 days to take off from capitalism, right?
Right, 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 right,
Like,
right.
hence the problems, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you understand too, as a therapist, just this space where the messaging is always, oh, we're the problem, we're the problem, we're the problem. And yes to our empowerment to
Mm,
change, but
mm,
also, God damn it, we have to point the arrow upwards at the
mm,
systems to
mm,
understand that we are fighting this uphill battle that is
mm,
actively against us. Because, yes,
mm.
10 days to go on a retreat, right? Not everyone has that freedom to even go off and experience these things as much as I think everybody would if we had the space in our society to do that.
Right. Right, right. Yeah, totally. I mean, certainly, there are certain cultures, like I spent some time in the Northern European, the Scandinavian
Hmm.
cultures, and, like paternal leave is, I don't know, 14 months or, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, not only does everyone have, access to medical and education and, without having to worry about busting the bank, but maternal leave and paternal leave is quite generous, as it should be. If you want a healthy society, you want the baby to feel supported in their first year. It's just makes total sense. But yeah, different societies definitely have different structures where that's more possible than others. Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. society, where both you and I reside, is a real kind of lab in seeing how many things can go wrong when capitalism is kind of the rule of the day. We're the wealthiest country, but the highest unemployment, the highest homelessness, the highest incarceration, the highest everything, when it comes to a total waste of human potential, for the sake of money. I mean, yeah. So anyways, that's a whole
Right.
soapbox. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think it's an important soapbox to talk about, right? The game of Monopoly. What
Hmm.
happens
Hmm.
as you start to get towards the end of the game when
Hmm.
someone starts to have all the money and starts to charge really high rents, right? And you start to realize, oh, okay, there's no winning in this, right? This has
Hmm.
an end
Hmm.
point, and that game was made to be a political statement about the systems that we are actively living into in this country.
Hmm. I think I might have listened to a podcast of yours
Mm.
that talked about the relationship between money and receiving pleasure.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think there's a correlation there, insofar as the more spaciousness we open to receiving, whether that's receiving from our own life force or receiving pleasure from a lover or receiving pleasure from nature, it's just all energy.
Mhm.
and the more we can receive in, monetary ways as well. I see that a lot with clients. It's like the
Mm,
more they open up, but it requires feeling safe in the body to open up, to receive, right? So
sure.
it really goes back to whatever, armor was there as a result of it feeling unsafe to receive. Or sometimes I'll have clients where as kids, like there were strings attached to a gift,
Right.
so now they're reluctant to receive. And so they're reluctant to receive a promotion or whatever it is. But I do
Mhm.
find there to be a correlation between receiving pleasure and receiving any other kind of energy.
Sure. Absolutely. Feeling unworthy.
Right. And once again, in a capitalist society, there's a pecking order that is designed to,
Right.
stimulate people to, work harder. I mean, that's it's the system.
Hmm.
What's interesting? I was listening to this interview, and it was a woman who lived in England.
Hmm.
And she was saying that in America, there's just such a hierarchical pecking order. Like when you go to events, there's a VIP section, but
Yeah.
then there's a super VIP section, and then an ultra VIP section,
Right.
And then I don't know, like I spent some time in Sweden, and in Sweden in particular, there's such a like I was sitting around a dinner table and we were all having a conversation, and they all wanted to make sure that everyone was heard in the conversation. And I feel like here it's kind of like winner takes all type of thing.
Hmm. Absolutely. Planes, right? Another great example. Who gets those big spaces on the plane, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
all these, Jesus, yeah, all the different things in that space that impact that. And yeah, I was thinking about even imposter syndrome, right? Even,
Hmm.
I know at the beginning you had mentioned just even enjoying my voice, right?
Yes, yes.
What does it mean for women to actually take that deep breath of embodiment? I
Hmm.
know if you go back to the 60s, you hear women, hi, I'm this person. Hi, and this is me, and I'm a woman, and I'm a nice woman. This is what I do. Right?
Hmm.
That, oof, like, do you feel the spaciousness to take the deep breath, slow down enough to know I have power here and I
Hmm.
can take up all the space that I need with my voice right now? That's a
Yeah,
journey for so many women, myself included.
totally. It's like, I mean, it shouldn't be, but it's revolutionary, even today, particularly in certain male-dominated fields. I feel for the bodies that, because I work with body armor and genital armor, I feel for the bodies that have to be armored.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard when you're having to protect yourself, right, from all of the societal messaging. So much so, this metaphor, sure, wherever we're going to go with it, I think about, like even puppies, right? You see
Mhm.
puppies and they are so loving and kind and just want to, run around, how cute. And of course, as the puppy grows up and if it's abused, then you go to pet the dog and it bites, right? To
Right.
keep itself safe, of
Exactly.
course,
Exactly.
right? But I view humans as inherently good. And I
Yes,
think that we have that same sort of experience, right? Where when you're going through the world with these attacks or these direct relational experiences, we body up with armor to protect ourselves.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy. I mean, I think of children because I love children, and they're
Mhm.
just like they're all tumbling over each other. They can't get enough of each other. One, they're
Sure.
so somatic. They're so
Sure.
touch based,
Yeah.
and they relate with touch. Yeah, orally,
Yep.
hands, like all of it. Yeah, all it takes is a little shock to the heart for that guarding to start, you know.
Mhm.
The life force wants to connect, it wants to feel aliveness, and
Mhm.
these multiple shocks to the heart start creating obstructions to it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of starting to open up the body more, of course, I'm just thinking about one, the power of taking a much deeper breath, right? And trying to actually fill up the belly with air when you take that breath and slowly let that go. But I'd be curious, how do you start to get people to have more of this embodiment and
Mm.
openness?
Mm. Yeah, there's many different ways based on the client's history, knowing what caused the armor
Sure.
and knowing during their traumatic periods of their life, what were the areas that were safe zones for them.
Mm-hmm.
right? So this can happen both psychologically, it could happen physiologically. So when someone is in a session or on my table, I'm always looking for the areas that feel good, where the client feels agency,
Yeah.
right? So maybe their heart is guarded, maybe their pelvis feels protected, but maybe they feel really good in their feet.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a really good place we can titrate to when we're addressing some traumatic event from their past to bring them back to their feet. Or psychologically, maybe it was their Aunt Martha who was like the loving force in their life, or maybe it was their dog, Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always looking for areas of agency in one's life.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we start to de-armor the body, de-armoring involves revisiting unintegrated emotions from
Yeah.
past trauma. And there needs to be enough agency and resource in the person's psyche or somatic embodiment in order to feel like they got this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm there to support them, but I want them to feel that within their own
Yeah.
psyche and body.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do genital de-armoring, it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the intravaginal space, the urethral sponge might be numb, the perineal sponge may have stinginess or burning, but the base of the clitoral shaft, there's resource there because there's pleasure. So we titrate. So we never want to overwhelm the client with too much challenge or difficulty. We want to go really gentle and then remind it of its agency and pleasure, and then go back to discharging something that was really difficult and then come back to their resource and pleasure. I'm really big on approaching the de-armoring experience both psychologically and somatically.
Sure.
And it's really important to kind of take inventory of the ways you were taught to accept, reject, or deny the beauty of your genitalia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like everything from, like in the course, all these questions go all the way back to how you were potty trained, what names were you given for their genitalia, how,
Right.
were you ever caught self-pleasuring? What was the result of that? And I've heard so many responses from, what often happens is some sort of shaming, you know,
Mm-hmm.
towards, there was one client where like her father opened her door, saw her self-pleasuring, and just like politely excused himself because he
Mm.
wanted to respect that, this is
Sure.
her and her genitalia. So like all of these things, influence how we relate to our genitalia as adults. And so it's important, like once you take inventory of it, it kind of starts to make sense. It's like, oh, this is why I never self-pleasured, as a teenager, because I thought I was going to go to hell, or I was told my, genitalia was going to fall off, or whatever it was, whatever the messaging was. So yeah, really taking inventory. And then I would say, for someone who wants to start, I really encourage people to journal with their
Mm.
genitalia, giving their genitalia a voice. And you can do that by, if you're a journaler, write in your journal with your dominant hand
Mm-hmm.
and then answer with your non-dominant hand. Just to start a dialogue, just to start a connection, like, a communication, so that your genitalia really feels honored and heard and seen and listened to.
Yeah. God, I would love for people to write out, how are you doing this? What feels good? Because, when people are in partner dynamics, it is almost as if we lack the language of
Mm,
how to communicate to other people to bring pleasure to our bodies. And so I just
so
can
true.
imagine this space of journaling. Okay, this is what I'm doing. This is how it feels. This is
Mm,
what my genitalia are saying, right? Wow, that is actively creating language that when
hmm.
and if you want to be with another person, you could actively say, this is how I experience pleasure. Can you do this for me?
Yes. Yes. Isn't that brilliant? It's like, yeah, and which makes so much sense because we really need to develop that self-intimacy with our own body before we can give voice to it and experience intimacy with another. And, like, I mean, I think it's very common for lovers and especially in the courtship, like we focus on making sure that our partner is pleasured, and we kind of like don't even attune to what it is our body wants.
Mm,
And what's dangerous is that can become a pattern pretty quickly
mhm.
in an interrelational dynamic.
Right. particularly for women, right, who have been
Absolutely.
taught that you're not sexual. You are here to give this to the sexual man, right? Again, in this
Yeah.
heteronormative world, right? And
Yeah.
so that's how we get things like the orgasm gap, all these larger, pieces that are directly impacting us. So I'm just thinking about what the power it would be for women to really be able to name this in their
Yes.
dynamics and say, this
Yes.
is what I want and this is what feels good for me. And just the beauty of sharing that with someone, right? Maybe you're taking turns of who's focusing on
Mm.
receiving rather than this constant having to feel like you're giving to each other, right? There's a lot of power in allowing someone to relax and receive and not have to have those expectations to always be giving at the same time.
Totally. There's, a wonderful exercise that was developed by Dr. Betty Martin called the 3 minute game.
Yeah.
And I share it with most clients who are in relationships because most clients who are in relationships do not, a couple of things. One, they really lack proper foreplay, right?
Hmm.
Before penetration. They also are not really well practiced, as you're pointing out, in asking for what they want. So the 3 minute game is a really great, structured, and the point of it isn't just to give and receive, but to see like what is going on in your conditioning that you have difficulty asking for what you want.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I had her on the podcast and we
Did
talked
you?
about that. Yeah, it was really
Oh,
exciting.
good.
The listeners could go and listen to that episode with Betty and the more if we talked about that there because there's
Mm,
so much tied up with consent and touch and giving and receiving, which we're kind of talking about here. And we got into a little bit deeper there of what comes up for people when you start to unpack this. Again,
yeah,
it's a psychedelic experience, in my opinion, right?
totally, totally. It's
Given
so
the
deep.
context. Yes,
I
there's so
totally
many
agree.
messages. Yeah, exactly. For us to unpack with our body that are impacting this. And what pleasure is on the other side? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And what's really exciting is when I start to see clients naming what it is that their body
Mm,
wants. It's almost it's giving their body a whole language. It's a whole
yeah.
way of communicating. And then it opens up realms of like intimacy dynamics.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of the emotionality wheel that we have as therapists, right? Where when people come into the room and they're experiencing emotions that we don't have words for, aka somatic experiences, right? Lots of somatic
Yes.
experiences without words for our sexuality and even more expansively our sensuality, right? Is a whole
Hmm.
thing of the same caliber, right? My body's
Hmm.
experiencing all of these emotions, but I don't have the words to point to my pleasure. And so,
Hmm.
what power, then to explore the words on that wheel so that we can have more ownership and autonomy and the ability to express that to the people in our lives. It's truly
Yes.
a language.
It's a language. And you're speaking to the, it's like the education of intimacy.
Hmm.
It's like like nobody gets it. I mean, we don't even get a proper sexual education, much less intimacy education. But developing that language and that ability to attune to our emotions, express them, and really dance in that dance of intimacy,
Yeah.
that's all. I mean, these are things that every society needs to have a healthy society, and it is
Hmm.
absent. It's really absent. We're learning by default and by making mistakes.
Right. And when you're getting in that argument with a partner, a coworker, a friend, you know what happens? Your voice goes up, that chest starts to tight,
Mhm.
rah, like, oh, what an
Mhm.
embodied experience to be able to stay connected to. So I could
Yeah.
realize, okay, I'm starting to react. I need to go take that walk. I need to go take a breath before we continue to
Mm.
do this. I mean, so much of the intimacy, sure, the psychology, right? That's all of what we've been taught, but God damn it, the body. Like, how are we missing
Mhm.
this crucial component of intimacy and connection and everything we know about mirror neurons and co regulation, right? As your
Mhm.
partner starts to get in that space, if you are looking at them, you're going to feel in your body, because of the mirror neurons, what they're starting to feel. And your
Yes.
voice is going to start to feel that same lifting as their, voice starts to come up. And so, one of you needs to be able to ground, right? And
Hmm.
pause. And I just,
Hmm.
it's mind boggling to me that we have all this psychological research, but the body is still such a lacking component. And it's so deeply connected to our pleasure and all of our intimacy.
All of our intimacy, and I would say so much of our intuition, it's like
Yeah,
it's all body based. And
sure.
yeah, I'm a big fan of there's a somatic modality called neuroaffective touch, and it was developed by Dr. Aileen Lapierre, who was a senior somatic experiencing trainer. She often says that in the same ways plant gravitates towards the sun for nourishment, like we human beings, we gravitate towards human connection
Yeah.
and aliveness.
Mm-hmm.
And, it always stays with me because this is what brings vibrancy and health and pleasure and joy and, all
Yeah.
the things that we're really designed to experience and explore here.
Yeah, it reminds me of in the work with psychedelics, we talk a lot of the metaphor of inner healing wisdom. And that is exactly one of the metaphors we use, right? Just like a plant knows how to turn towards the light, just like our body, when you have a cut, the scars form. It's not like we have to think about that, right? And
Mm,
what if our psyches were similar, right? We have these experiences and we know where to go, right? That's the content that's coming up in the psychedelic experience, the piece to be healed, right? And
mm,
so
mm,
I think starting to, like we were saying, right, this somatic body pieces of that, what does it mean to listen to your gut?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I so I've done the somatic, the neuroaffective touch training, and I've assisted for several years after.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly comprised of marriage and family therapists, and they're all so foreign to
Mm.
touch.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of ironic. I mean, it kind of makes sense on the one hand, like all the education that's necessary to become, licensed as a psychotherapist, and on the other hand, like the body is our home, and it is where our
Yeah.
intuition stems from, and it's holding all these memories, and it's a gold mine,
Mm-hmm.
of wisdom, of memories, of knowing like what needs to be healed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're a part of changing the paradigms on that,
And
right?
yes,
Through these
yes.
conversations and sexological body workers, particularly because it's not in this framework of disease model, like more of a pelvic floor therapist, right? Okay, we're going to go
Yes.
through this and work on a disease model of this is what's going on versus, hey, let's reconnect with pleasure and feeling
Hmm.
that. So I just want to say, thank you for all of the work that you're doing in this space to bring more of that energy into the world. We need that.
Well, thank you for creating this
Ah,
platform,
thank you.
and just you're demonstrating through the structure of having every guest invite the next guest. Like, I mean, you're demonstrating what possibilities of life force flow can happen organically when we let go of control and we trust, the energy of creativity and connection.
I appreciate you seeing me in that and the journey that it's been over the last couple of years. And I would not be the person that I am if it wasn't for all of these recordings each week that are shifting
Mm,
me, right? This conversation shifts me. I do the next one.
mm.
And so I'm really, really thankful for all of the guests and the journey that it's been.
Oh, super cool. It's super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very exciting.
hmm I want to hold some space as we come towards the end of our time. I
Hmm.
always check in with the guest and, ask them to take that deep breath and see if there's anything else on their heart that they're still wanting to share with the listeners.
Well, the thing I want to impart is, I think personal power, and even that word power is a little kind of aggressive. It's really personal attunement and personal intimacy is such an empowering, enlivening force that brings aliveness and self-connection. And I feel like so much of that revolves around our relationship with our own genitalia. And we live in a society that shames sexuality. It's very schizophrenic, especially here in the States, where it's glorified in media and yet it's shamed in the home and the church. And it's almost like you can't live in the society and not have armor form around the pelvis because it's like, and then you've got a catcalling culture and I mean, young women who are developing need to protect their body, like all this kind of stuff. And I just want to encourage people to check in with
Mm-hmm.
your genitalia, with your
Mm-hmm.
pelvis, and attune to what it needs, what it wants from you. What does it want to experience? And just checking in, for a few minutes every night, or however works for you, can really be a game shifting practice. So that's
Right.
what I want to impart.
Yeah. No goals,
Right.
no productivity that needs to be met here, right? Just
Hmm.
inviting more of that curiosity of, yeah, like we were talking earlier, what does my genitalia need?
Hmm. Simple.
Right, exactly. Just curiosity.
Hmm.
A powerful practice.
Yes.
Well, if it feels good to you, I'll guide us towards our closing question.
Sure.
Okay. So, the one question that I ask every guest is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Oh my gosh. So as a somatic sex educator, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of intakes, probably thousands at this point.
Sure.
Everybody thinks that their
Yeah.
sexual,
Yep.
kink or desire
Yeah.
or fantasy is
No.
so weird and fucked up and whatever. And it's so common. Like, first of all, I ask every client, like, what was their first introduction to their sexual pleasure? And people are so embarrassed. And it's so
Mm,
common that it's like, of course it's going to be the shower head from their jacuzzi or their
right.
or their teddy bear, or like
Right.
whatever it was, like, and it's so common, but everyone thinks they're the only person, and they're so, there's such shame about it. And so the one thing I want to make normal is like sexuality and all the ways that sexuality gets explored and expressed,
Mm,
and, out of a curiosity of an innocent child is absolutely normal.
right. Exactly. What a world it would be if we could open up our chest a little bit
Mm,
wider, to
mm,
take a deep breath and
mm.
to let that go.
Totally.
Mm,
Totally.
I hope to see it in my lifetime, and if not, we know that future generations will be there more than we could have ever dreamed of.
Absolutely. I believe that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it was such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
Yeah,
it was a great experience, and thank you for the invitation.
of course. Where do you want to plug for people who are interested in learning more about your work and want to connect with you?
Oh, sure. Thanks for that
Mhm.
invitation. So the body of work I offer is called Somatic Sexual Wholeness. And if you go to somaticsexualwholeness.com, you will see courses, retreats. I have a podcast of my own called Organic Sexuality, and you can reach out to me. It's all on that site.
Great. I'll have all of that linked below. And so thank you for joining me and all of the listeners today.
You're so welcome, Nicole. Great to connect with you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.